Bumpy Johnson carried a straight razor, not a gun, not a revolver tucked into his coat like every other gangster walking the streets of New York in the 1930s. People asked him why, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes out of disbelief, wondering why a man with his reputation would rely on something that looked more at home in a barbershop than in the underworld. Why not carry a .45 like the Italians? Why not use the same firepower that ruled the city? Why choose a blade when bullets decided most arguments? Bumpy would smile when they asked, the kind of smile that made people uneasy because it carried patience instead of humor. Then he would answer in a voice so calm it felt rehearsed, saying, "Guns are loud. Guns bring police. A razor is personal." To Bumpy Johnson, violence wasn't about noise or spectacle. It was about control, and a gun gave too much of that control away. With a trigger, distance does the work. The moment ends quickly, and the man holding the weapon never has to truly face what he's doing. A razor was different. A razor demanded closeness. It forced you to step into another man's space, close enough to smell his breath, close enough to look directly into his eyes and see the fear form before the pain ever arrived. There was no echo, no bang, no warning sound for the police to follow, only silence thick enough to suffocate the room. That silence carried its own terror because everyone knew what it meant when Bumpy Johnson chose to get close instead of loud. The razor wasn't a symbol of weakness, it was a statement of intent. It said this wasn't random, this wasn't sloppy, and this wasn't business done in a hurry. A blade required patience, precision, and responsibility because once you used it, there was no denying what you'd done or who had done it. If you cut a man with a razor, you owned that moment forever, and Bumpy Johnson believed real power meant never running from the consequences of your actions. By 1935, Harlem understood exactly what that razor represented. They knew the stories, they knew the alleys where men had been found opened instead of shot, and they knew that Bumpy Johnson didn't make empty threats. He didn't need to raise his voice or flash a weapon because the razor spoke for him long before it ever touched skin. And on one night in March, inside Harlem's most sacred ballroom, that razor was about to remind everyone why silence could be far more terrifying than sound. In 1935, Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a fortress built out of culture, pride, and survival. It was a place where black excellence had carved out space in a country that refused to make room, a place alive with music pouring from windows, poetry spoken on street corners, and ambition burning in every crowded apartment. Harlem was loud during the day, electric at night, and always watching for outsiders who thought money alone could buy respect. This was the heart of the Harlem Renaissance, where art wasn't decoration, it was resistance. Writers, musicians, dancers, hustlers, preachers, and dreamers all shared the same streets, each one carrying the weight of a country that treated them as less than human. Harlem didn't ask for permission to exist. It built its own rules, its own economy, and its own sense of justice because no one else was going to provide it. Music was the lifeblood of that world, and nowhere did it flow stronger than inside the Savoy Ballroom. The Savoy wasn't just a venue, it was sacred ground. A massive block-long dance hall on Lenox Avenue between 140th and 141st Streets, with two bandstands and a polished maple floor big enough to hold thousands of bodies moving as one. When the Savoy was alive, the floor shook, the walls sweated, and the sound carried for blocks. What made the Savoy different wasn't just its size, it was its soul. Unlike the Cotton Club, where black performers entertained white audiences under strict rules, the Savoy was integrated, one of the few places in America where black and white could dance together, breathe the same air, and forget the outside world for a few precious hours. That alone made it dangerous, because it challenged the lie that separation was natural or necessary. Inside the Savoy, music erased lines that money and power tried to enforce everywhere else. Duke Ellington, Chick Webb, Ella Fitzgerald, and the greatest names of the era didn't just perform there, they defined what black excellence looked like on its own terms. Every note played inside those walls was a statement, every dance step a quiet rebellion against a society built to keep them small. To Harlem, the Savoy mattered more than money, more than territory, more than any numbers racket or backroom deal. It was proof that dignity could exist even in a hostile world, that beauty could survive under pressure, and that respect didn't have to be borrowed from anyone. The Savoy was where Harlem saw itself reflected at its best, not broken, not ashamed, but powerful. That's why what happened that night cut so deep. An insult inside the Savoy wasn't just bad manners, it was an attack on everything Harlem had built. To disrespect a musician, there was to disrespect the community, the culture, and the fragile peace they had carved out with their own hands. Anyone who failed to understand that didn't belong in that room, and Bumpy Johnson understood it better than most. He knew Harlem wasn't defended only by fists or blades, but by protecting the places that gave people pride when the world offered them none. The Savoy was one of those places, and on that night in 1935, it became the line no outsider was allowed to cross. Vic the Blade. Romano didn't walk into Harlem like a guest. He walked in like a man who believed the city owed him something. A capo tied to Dutch Schultz's organization, Vic carried himself with the careless confidence of someone used to being feared, someone who thought his name alone could bend rooms to his will. He wasn't there for the music, and he wasn't there for Harlem. He was there to remind everyone who he thought really ran New York. Dutch Schultz's crew had been pushing north for months, testing boundaries, sending enforcers to collect, intimidate, and remind people that Italian money came with Italian rules. Vic Romano was part of that pressure, a message delivered in silk suits and crude laughter, and that night at the Savoy, he believed he was untouchable. He sat near the stage with 6 of his men, all armed, all drunk, all convinced Harlem was just another stop on someone else's map. From the moment they arrived, they made sure they were heard. Loud jokes that didn't quite hide the slurs, laughter that lingered too long, comments aimed just above a whisper so everyone nearby could feel the insult without hearing the words clearly. They mocked the dancers, sneered at the music, and treated the room like a novelty, something to be consumed and discarded when the night was over. Bumpy Johnson saw it all from the back wall. He didn't react, didn't intervene, didn't interrupt the music, because he understood something Vic didn't. Harlem watched first. Harlem remembered. And Harlem chose its moment carefully. Disrespect was tolerated until it crossed into something else, something public, something impossible to ignore. Duke Ellington was at the piano when it happened, lost in the rhythm, fingers moving with the kind of precision that made the entire room disappear. It Don't Mean a Thing was building, the horns rising, the floor alive with movement, the crowd completely surrendered to the sound. For a few minutes, Harlem wasn't a place under siege. It was free. That's when Vic Romano stood up. He grabbed a bottle of champagne, popped the cork with exaggerated flair, and laughed as the foam spilled over his hand. He raised the bottle like a joke, like a celebration, like a man about to perform for an audience that didn't matter to him. Then he sprayed it. The champagne arced through the air and exploded across the stage, soaking Duke Ellington mid-note, splashing his tuxedo, the piano, his face, his eyes. The music collapsed instantly, not with a crash, but with confusion, as instruments faltered and stopped one by one. Duke stood there dripping, frozen in the way black performers had learned to be frozen when humiliation came from men with power. Vic laughed loudly, too loudly. "Dance, boy," he said, grinning at the stage. "Earn that paycheck." The Savoy went silent, not the comfortable pause between songs, but the suffocating silence of a room that understands something irreversible has just happened. 200 people stopped breathing at once, because everyone knew that insult wasn't aimed at one man, it was aimed at Harlem itself. Champagne dripped from Duke's sleeves onto the polished floor. The greatest musician in the room stood humiliated, not because he lacked dignity, but because dignity had been publicly challenged in a space built to protect it. That was the moment the night changed, because the insult wasn't private, and it wasn't accidental. Bumpy Johnson's hand moved to his waistband, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough for those who knew him to understand exactly what was coming. He didn't look at Vic right away. He looked at the room, at the faces frozen in fear, at the musicians unsure whether to move, at Duke Ellington standing still under the lights. Vic Romano was still laughing. He didn't see the shift yet, didn't feel the weight of the silence pressing in around him. To him, it was just another joke, another reminder of who he thought held power. He didn't understand that some rooms don't forgive, and some insults don't fade. In that moment, the Savoy stopped being a dance hall and became a courtroom. The charge had been announced without words, the verdict already forming in the minds of everyone present. Vic Romano had humiliated a black genius in the heart of Harlem, in a place that existed to say that kind of humiliation no longer applied. And somewhere between the last drop of champagne hitting the floor and the first step Bumpy Johnson took forward, Vic Romano unknowingly signed his own sentence. Bumpy Johnson pushed himself off the back wall slowly, deliberately, like a man who had already made his decision and didn't need to rush it. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture, didn't signal anyone for help because he didn't need to. The moment his body shifted, the room felt it, a quiet change in pressure that everyone recognized even if they couldn't explain it. His shoes hit the polished maple floor, and the sound carried farther than it should have. Click, click, click. Patent leather against wood, steady and unhurried, cutting through the silence that had swallowed the Savoy. Each step felt louder than the last, not because he was stomping, but because no one else was making a sound. People began to move, without being told. Dancers stepped aside, tables shifted, bodies leaned back, just enough to create space. The crowd parted instinctively, like water moving around a stone, because Harlem knew that walk. They had seen it before, in other rooms, on other nights, when something had gone too far and couldn't be taken back. Bumpy didn't look left or right as he crossed the floor. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, calm, empty, focused, as if the room itself no longer mattered. He wasn't angry, and that frightened people more than rage ever could. Anger was loud and unpredictable, but this was something colder, something measured. Vic Romano was still standing near the stage when he finally noticed the shift. His laughter slowed, then stopped altogether as he saw heads turning, bodies moving, and a clear path opening through the center of the Savoy. For the first time that night, uncertainty crossed his face, because whatever joke he thought he was telling no longer seemed funny to anyone else.